Obamacare, the Affordable Care Act, the individual mandate, who must comply, presented by myself, Avery Lawrence Otto, and created by James Lawrence Otto. So this individual mandate, well, for almost everyone, that's the biggest effect of the Affordable Care Act. Now, the individual mandate is the requirement that you and those that you are responsible for must either have adequate insurance or qualify for an exemption to the mandate, or you're going to have to pay a tax penalty to the IRS. Now, don't get the individual mandate confused with a different set of rules called the employer mandate. That forces employers to provide adequate or affordable insurance plans to their workers. The individual mandate is the one that hits you, not your boss. The individual mandate begins January 1st, 2014, and any penalty will be due with your tax return in 2015. You will be responsible for covering yourself and those who depend on you. Now, your main question is, do I need health insurance for the individual mandate? To answer this, you need to answer 4 smaller questions. Who must comply? What is adequate coverage? What are the exemptions to the individual mandate? And what is the penalty? Now, we will only deal with who must comply here. The adequate kind of coverage is called MEC, or Minimum Essential Coverage, and we deal with it and exemptions and the penalty later. When you finish the series, you should have a good idea of how the individual mandate works. By the time you need to deal with the red tape, there's going to be people to help sort it all out. So who must comply? Well, the individual mandate applies to taxpayers. It is enforced by the IRS on your income tax return. If you don't make enough to file income taxes, there's an exemption. IRS cutely calls the penalty your shared responsibility payment. So the mandate applies to U.S. citizens and resident aliens and to all ages, children, adults, and senior citizens. The basic idea is that a taxpayer is responsible for anyone he or she could properly claim for the income tax exemption deduction, and that's whether or not the taxpayer claims that person for the deduction or not. So some people may be liable for more individuals under the mandate than they take income tax deductions for as dependents. It's a little bit complicated, but we'll make sure that you get it all sorted out. Who you need to worry about. Well, to figure out who you need to worry about, go to the definition of a dependent under Tax Code, Section 152, and decide whether or not you could properly claim that person as a dependent. Basically, a dependent is 1, your spouse if you don't file jointly and your spouse has no gross income and isn't someone else's dependent. 2, a qualifying child, including nephews, grandchildren, or whatever. As long as they're not someone else's dependent, they can be claimed. Now, a child can be up to age 19 or to age 24 if they're a student. Number 3, a qualifying relative, including in-laws, if the person's income is less than the exemption, which is about $2,000, and you pay for more than half their support that year. Or 4, a non-relative who lives with you if the person's income is less than the exemption, which is basically $2,000, and you pay more than half their support that year. So what else do you need to worry about? Well, if 2 different taxpayers could claim a dependent that year, the one who properly claims the dependent is liable. If more than one taxpayer could claim the dependent that year, but nobody does, the taxpayer with the priority under Tax Code Section 152 is the one who is liable. Now, there are special rules when a child is adopted or put into foster care during this year. Now, if a taxpayer and a spouse file a joint income taxes return, they are jointly liable. If a taxpayer is personally exempt, he or she is still liable for any non-exempt dependents who lack coverage. If one spouse filing a joint return is exempt, both spouses are still jointly liable for the dependents. To make this all much more complicated, for each person, the MEC, or exemptions, because sometimes there can be more than one exemption per person, and the penalty for that person are all calculated by the month. Now, minimum essential coverage for 1 day a month counts as coverage for the whole month. Also, an exemption that applies for 1 day of the month counts as an exemption for the whole month. Just remember, for each dependent, for each month, 1 day of coverage, or 1 day of exemption, or penalties. Now you should have a good idea of which people you need to worry about. Fortunately, this monthly business isn't quite as bad as it looks because most kinds of coverage and many of the exemptions operate on an annual basis, so you won't have to always be refiguring this stuff every month for most dependents. Next, we're going to look at the kind of insurance you need, and then later we're going to examine the exemptions from the individual mandate and how the penalty works. So our next video is on the Affordable Care Act Minimal Essential Coverage, or MEC. Thank you for watching.